Should trans people have rights? Well, I don't know. I feel like since we live in a country that was founded upon the principle that we're all created equal and deserve all the same rights and liberties, and since anyone who has ever opposed rights for minorities has always been remembered as a bigot and a villain of history, it seems to me that the simple answer is yes.
Oh no, someone tell this guy that these were all Democrats. The Democrats were pro-slavery, the Democrats were the party of the KKK, and they were in favor of Jim Crow laws. Not a good look. And somebody has to question these people about what a right is, because I feel like they don't know the definition of that word.
So let's look at a primary source, like the Constitution. The 14th Amendment says, "No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." This basically means the government needs to treat everyone equally. But turns out that many of our conservative friends disagree.
Is he going to explain which constitutional rights that conservatives want to take away from trans people? No, he's not, because they aren't trying to do that. What's curious, though, is I can think of a very important constitutional right that trans activists have tried to take away from people for the past decade.
Criticizing trans in like 2021 or 2022 would get you deplatformed.
I actually think the trans stuff goes as far back as 2019, and radical leftists have been arguing to repeal or circumvent First Amendment protections for over a decade now. That being said, today we're going to talk about an up-and-coming 19-year-old YouTuber who goes by Hadi Rahim, who's had a couple of hit videos recently because, thanks to the whole Dean Withers crowd, a lot of people are getting their political takes from influencers who just barely became adults. But the reason this person caught my interest is because he makes videos that are, for the most part, pretty well put together, and he's very good at appearing that he's very knowledgeable in his field. To give a backhanded compliment, he sounds super smart if you don't have much prior knowledge in these areas, and if you don't have a lot of critical thinking skills that would cause you to question certain things. However, if you do the slightest bit of fact-checking, you can see he has no idea what he's doing. That's the real problem, and the illusion of intelligence or competence from political pundits has become quite annoying. For example,
the scientific community largely agrees that gender-affirming care, even for minors, saves lives. This scientific consensus, and yes, it's a scientific consensus, this isn't just an appeal to an authority. This is the result of numerous peer-reviewed studies that found that gender-affirming care has led to significantly lower rates of depression and suicidality among people with dysphoria.
I mean, arguing in favor of consensus is also a logical fallacy, just like appeals to authority. Lots of people believing something doesn't necessarily mean it's true, especially on a politically charged issue where there is a lot of censorship of dissenting opinion. I mean, they tried to kick Jordan Peterson out of his university and went after his clinical license for extremely moderate takes on this issue, one of which Hadi plays in his video on trans people.
Kids are confused enough when they're growing up. I think to add gender confusion to that, which we're doing very, very rapidly, is going to destroy 15 people for every one it saves.
I'm surprised this guy Hadi is so concerned with stuff like constitutional rights, but doesn't mention the horrendous amount of censorship around this issue. Well, he's only 19 and probably just started caring about this stuff a year ago after he took Political Science 101, so he might not be aware of the censorship stuff because they stopped doing a lot of it in 2023. But according to him, there is a massive consensus in the scientific world that gender-affirming care works. Maybe this data is so correct that it should be criminal to speak out against it, and there are totally no conflicts of interest here, like how much of a moneymaker this all is because gender-affirming care is expensive. That being said, let's look at the studies. Hadi flashes 11 studies across the screen, which I can almost guarantee that he didn't read, especially considering that most of these studies are paywalled, and this one even disagrees with his point. But more importantly, I looked over every single one, and yes, after they did gender-affirming care like giving hormones to children, they reportedly saw some improvement in mental health. Well, except for this study that said there was basically no change, and the ones who already had good mental health before the study still had good mental health after, and the ones with bad mental health still had bad mental health after the study. Outside of that, the biggest problem with all these studies is that they don't test gender-affirming care against other types of treatment. So it could be the case that children talking to a therapist is twice as effective at improving mental health as taking hormones that will sterilize them. Because he doesn't show how these treatments perform against others in terms of gender dysphoria, all of this data is very weak evidence of Hadi's points. And the constant overconfidence in how correct he is as he shows useless data makes him look very uneducated. Anyway, let's continue with his statements on the effectiveness of gender-affirming care.
It's also way less harmful than suicide or self-affliction, which unfortunately many untreated patients with gender dysphoria fall victim to. So when red states ban gender-affirming care to protect kids, they're actually doing the opposite.
Where's the data for that? You had studies for everything else, but no studies for the most important thing, which is to prove that lack of gender-affirming care is actually costing lives? What number of lives is this affecting? You made a whole 20-minute video talking about this, and you don't have one paper that proves that this is the problem? I mean, that's why we're doing the gender-affirming care, right? It's to save lives. Why else are you showing elementary school students videos like this?
Hi, baby. Are you a boy or a girl?
Funny you should ask, Sid. The way your body looks on the outside is only part of the story. And your gender doesn't always match the sex you were called when you were born.
Okay.
So if this is all a naturally occurring phenomenon, then why do you have to teach young, impressionable kids about it en masse? The ones who it applies to would know it internally, and they can seek help as needed. But anyway, these people are always silent when it comes to proving their claims about not allowing kids going to gender-affirming care, causing them to die. Personally, I think it's because they have zero or very weak evidence that this is the case, as when people have tried to show data for this like Noah Sampson, the participants being studied are all adults, not children, and they have tons of more important factors for poor mental health like homelessness, alcoholism, and evidence of child sexual abuse. I can imagine that treating those would be a lot more effective at preventing suicidal ideation than hormones, because what the hell do hormones have to do with solving more serious mental health problems like addiction?
It's also been found to be safe. Side effects can cause harm, but they're honestly just as harmful as some of the side effects of other elective procedures.
What the hell? Is this guy high? The kind of gender-affirming care noted in those studies was hormone replacement therapy, and that shit sterilizes you. That's a pretty important side effect. And they're doing this to kids as young as 13 years old from what I've seen. Actually, later in his video, he talks about a kid who got HRT at 14 years old. Like, how do you make a video about conservatives and dance around their main issue with the transgender stuff? He never counter-argues against his opposition's points on sterilization in the video. Okay, this Star Wars meme on screen is great.
And by the way, when it comes to trans kids, very, very, very few even get surgical interventions. This recent study found that only 2.1 per 100,000 minors aged 15 to 17 got surgeries. That number is even smaller for minors aged 13 to 14, at only 0.1 per 100,000. The researchers could find no data on minors under 12 getting surgery. Now, this data is from 2019, and the numbers could have risen in the years since, but even if you quintuple these numbers, we're still talking about less than 300 or 400 people.
The number should be 0. It should be 0 kids getting surgical interventions for this.
I know a lot of people instinctively say, we should ban the procedures until they're 18 or 21, and people who say this are just basing their opinions on vibes.
Oh man, this guy's about 6 months away from arguing why the age of consent law shouldn't exist for sex. You know, because it's just about vibes.
Shouldn't the age that you are allowed to have sex be based on when you reach sexual maturity? Why is it considered such a moral crime and a sick thing to like a 16-year-old?
Yeah, anyway, let's continue talking about why this guy thinks that kids should be allowed to go on hormone replacement therapy.
If a 16-year-old with gender dysphoria goes to a doctor, and the doctor comes to the conclusion that hormone replacement therapy would significantly improve their mental health and even save their life, and their parents go with them and consent, what's wrong with them receiving treatment? I thought you guys were all about parental rights. Why should the government get between a child, a parent, and their doctor? I thought you guys were the party of small government.
I mean, tattoos aren't even permanent, technically, and a 13-year-old wouldn't be allowed to get one even if their parents consented. But you know, why have any law that supersedes parental consent? Let's just make it so kids are allowed to drink a 6-pack of beer every day if their parents say they can. It's not like there are any mentally deranged parents who would do things like trick their kids into consenting to sexual abuse, because stories like that totally don't exist on a podcast called We're All Insane. And certainly, no parent has ever groomed their kid into being trans.
You're a boy, right?
No, I'm a girl.
Who told you you're a girl?
Mommy.
The state of California says that I have to pay for the chemical and physical castration of my son as child support. I'm not going to pay that child support. I'm not going to pay anything to hurt my son.
And that means you'll be going to prison?
California is going to send me to prison for that.
The world isn't black and white, and there are certain limitations that we have on certain beliefs, because making them a free-for-all where anything goes is stupid. Like pot should be legal like alcohol is, but maybe it's a terrible idea to make crystal meth or fentanyl available at the store for recreational use.
The reality is that kids who get these procedures do so with their parents' expressed permission, who have their children's best interest in mind. No 5-year-old is walking into a doctor's office saying, I feel like a girl, and walking out with a gallon of estrogen. Children generally cannot get medical care without their parents' consent. You all know this. Why are you acting like this is not the case?
I mean, kids can get an abortion without their parents' consent, and as far as I'm aware, kids are allowed to get gender-affirming care without their parents' consent, to an extent, In fact, in places like California schools, they were trying to hide from parents that they were doing that, which is why people started getting outraged at school board meetings.
And I found out after 2.5 years, they had been transitioning my son secretly behind my back. So I would bring my son to Pinkerton Middle School in Capel in boys' clothes, and they would give him a dress and tell him to use the girls' bathroom.
It's not like this is unheard of. Encouraging kids to be trans without notifying their parents is believed to be moral by a lot of leftists.
So if you guys could change the Constitution in one way, how would you change it?
Rights to abortion, like transgender rights to have surgery without necessarily parental consent.
Not to mention, you had Keffels and Eli Ehrlich openly trafficking hormones to children. Stuff like that is why people are mad. A bunch of strangers are trying to convince their children they will die unless they get super invasive medical interventions that have permanent life-altering side effects. Okay, so moving on. Now we're going to talk about trans athletes. Apparently that's just a silly Republican grift to get votes because every other issue was unpopular.
This wasn't always a top issue among Republican voters. The current trans panic is very new, dating back to like 2022.
I mean, the trans stuff has been a hot topic for like a decade. You even used a popular Ben Shapiro segment from like 2015 in your video, so maybe Google Trends isn't the most accurate measurement here.
In 2020, they fearmongered about BLM, but most Americans actually supported the protests, so that didn't work.
Okay, so how many people knew the protests in 2020 were actually riots? The media spent a ton of time calling them peaceful to confuse people.
In the summer of 2021, the new boogeyman was critical race theory, and while it did lead to Republicans winning the Virginia governorship, it failed to gain much traction beyond that. The outrage was a fad. But by around the summer of 2022 to like early 2023, they finally figured out that if they fearmongered about trans people, they could actually get tens of thousands of working class Americans to vote for the party that bails out the rich and continually tries to take away health care.
What are you talking about? Race relations and black fatigue is one of the hottest topics right now, especially during the time he was making this video because of Carmelo Anthony. Also, Democrats bail out rich people too. Every politician does that because they won't get voted in if they don't give favors to rich supporters. Consider reading the Dictator's Handbook for more info on that. Also, Obama made healthcare way more expensive, so that's his legacy to Americans. And this is all as if Democrats haven't been using the LGBT stuff to get votes and distract people from more pressing issues for the past decade and a half. Certainly, there aren't a bunch of companies that grift off of trans issues as a PR strategy, and there definitely isn't an entire month out of every year that has the sole purpose of boosting sales for a number of corporations. All right, let's talk about sports.
Okay, but the problem with forcing trans athletes to compete only with members of their biological sex is that you're going to run into the exact same problem with trans men. This is literally what happened in Texas when Mac Beggs, a trans man who was in the process of transitioning by taking testosterone, won the state high school women's wrestling championship in 2017. Transphobes use this as an example to go, see, look, this poor, innocent girl is being beaten up by this violent trans person. Except this isn't a biological man competing against a woman. It's a trans man being forced to compete with women because Texas state law prevented him from competing with men, where he wouldn't have had an unfair advantage. This is literally the result of policies that you advocate for. You're either being dishonest or you're too stupid to understand.
This is a bad argument. Nobody cares about women competing in men's sports, just like nobody really cares if women use the men's bathroom to skip the line for the women's bathroom. There's a certain direction that people want these rules to go in, and just like how Japan has women-only train cars, I don't think people really care if these laws were applied unequally across the sexes. So just fix the law so that it doesn't apply universally.
But how many trans athletes are even out there? Well, according to Charlie Baker, the president of the NCAA, of the 510,000 athletes competing at the collegiate level, fewer than 10 publicly identify as transgender.
This kid must listen to Dean Withers because that's his dumb argument too. The current number doesn't matter because 1, women shouldn't have to change with men in their locker rooms, and 2, if this goes unchecked, then eventually the number of trans athletes will increase until all the top athletes in women's sports are trans. It can take 100 people to make a competition, but only one of them can win first place, so there doesn't have to be that many trans athletes for it to be a problem. But none of that matters because all these people are hypocrites because Trump used to be pro-trans, and now he's grifting for votes.
The anti-trans crusade got Donald Trump, a man who used to passively support trans rights, into becoming the most dangerous threat to their existence. Don't believe me? Here's him in 2015 on bathroom bills.
Do you have any transgender people working in your organization?
I don't know.
No?
I really don't know. I probably do. I really don't know.
So if Caitlyn Jenner were to walk into Trump Tower and want to use the bathroom, you would be fine with her using any bathroom she chooses?
That is correct.
Here's him now.
Gender insanity, child abuse, chemical, physical, and emotional mutilation of our youth, and so-called gender-affirming care. Ridiculous. Mutating their physical appearance, mutilation of minor youth. Can you believe this? A concept that was never heard of. Under my leadership, this madness will end. Thank you very much.
Trump actually walked that statement about bathrooms back like a year later, so the change didn't happen after the great trans craze of 2022. Again, what is this kid smoking? Trans issues were much different in 2016 than they are today. Nobody really knew about the trans stuff outside of a conversation about bathrooms and maybe gender-neutral parenting. There wasn't tons of talk about giving hormones to kids at that point, so it's reasonable that Trump would expand on or change his views on this by 2024. And contrary to what these lefties say because they're too busy calling everyone Nazis, most people don't mind trans people. What they don't like are the activists and people going after kids with drugs that will sterilize them. Well, they also don't like pride parades and family-friendly drag shows because they're sexually inappropriate. The good news, though, is that Hadi thought this bad take about Trump changing was so good that he did it twice.
This is Nancy Mace, a South Carolina Republican congresswoman who has recently become obsessed with trans people. Ever since Congress got its first ever trans member, she's been trying to ban her from using women's bathrooms in the Capitol, and she succeeded. She regularly uses slurs for trans people, calls allies groomers, all in the name of protecting women's spaces. The thing is that this is all just a grift. Nancy Mace used to be supportive of trans rights as recently as 2 years ago.
Well, I'm pro transgender rights, I'm pro LGBTQ. Just don't go to the extreme with our kids. Our kids
define extremism there for me.
Sex change surgery, the hormone blockers that sterilize our children. We shouldn't be doing that when a child is prepubescent or going through puberty. Let that child go through the natural process of life and let them make that permanent decision when they're older. Now, if they want to take on a different pronoun or a different gender identity or grow their hair out or wear a dress or wear pants or do those things as a minor, those are all things that I think most people would support. Be who you want to be, but don't make those permanent changes when it's a child.
Why'd she shift? Simple. To fundraise and get attention. It's disgusting.
Where was the shift? This incredibly moderate position that she has here is the one that you've been calling bigoted this whole video. It seems like she's pretty consistent on her beliefs, though, considering that you've shown nowhere in this video that she was ever in favor of trans women in female bathrooms. You can say that adult men should be allowed to undergo transgender surgery while also being uncomfortable if men start entering women's bathrooms. And let me be clear on this, slight tangent, politicians are generally bad people and hypocrites. So with that in mind, you should never vote for a politician because you think they're an honest person. You should vote for politicians because of the values they're forced to promote to stay in power. Anyway, the arrogance that this guy has in the way he says stuff, followed by showing horrendous evidence of his points, is just annoying.
Why aren't corporations, right now, pulling out of states that ban gender-affirming care for minors, even if their parents consent? This is worse than the bathroom bill. It's literally killing people.
Study establishes first causal link between anti-trans laws and suicide attempts. Okay, so this is an NBC article that talks about a study that recruited people through social media. So when I say that correlation does not equal causation, what I mean is that recruiting a bunch of terminally online people for your study might not lead to the most accurate results. You know, considering the constant Trump derangement syndrome fear-mongering from the average TikTok user. Like, this is the type of person that you're recruiting for your study.
Opposition to trans rights will unfortunately continue to be a thing for years to come. But we shouldn't lose hope. We are on the right side of this. History is not kind to bigots.
Right, the ones with the good historical takes always have to announce that they're on the right side of history. I swear, this is like an archetype of internet person who knows nothing about politics, but is super arrogant in their beliefs.
China's communism. I've been to China.
China's not communist.
Huh?
China's not communist.
What are they?
They're a socialist country.
Socialist?
Yes.
Have you ever been to China?
Have I? No.
Let me tell you something. It is the most oppressed country I've ever been to.
Look, no. China is not oppressed. Look at China. They have great social safety nets.
I was like, oh, I'm the only Asian person in the room, so it's like so weird to see somebody kind of like debate about a country that my mom is from. I would have to agree with John more in terms of like China being a communist country.
Even the Chinese girl said he was wrong. Though I think the real lesson here is to be more reserved in your opinion instead of firing out a bunch of blind accusations with very low accuracy, especially when it only takes a few minutes of reading to disprove you. I mean, with all due respect, Dean Withers was much better at this. It took me hours per subject to fact check him. But more importantly, just because someone sounds smart doesn't mean they are. And because of that, when it comes to politics and research, I really think people need to set aside the emotional appeal of somebody or how grounded they sound, and instead focus more on the content of what they're saying. Like Noah Samson is very good at emotionally appealing to people, but the minute you start asking questions, he stumbles for 2 hours against Vosh and never debates again. So when you watch internet influencers, at least to some extent you should say, how do you know that? And if all they can do is show you the titles of 11 articles they almost certainly didn't read, then you probably shouldn't take their opinion too seriously. Also, maybe people shouldn't be getting their political takes from influencers who just graduated high school. Anyway, thanks for watching, follow me on Twitter, and I'll see you in the next video.